Well, I'm Susan James, Vice President of the Historical Society and Assistant Director here at the library. And I want to thank Jill for coming tonight, and thank Ken Miller for letting us hold this on a Wednesday when the library is usually closed. Thank you too to people for their help with refreshments: Sharon Font, Mary June, Janet Russell, Carolyn Person. Jill Brumwell grew up in the Sioux and graduated from Sioux High. Later she moved downstate, where she currently spends part of the year. She grew up with a strong interest in history. Her family goes back many generations on Drummond Island. Her mother was considered the island historian. 12 years ago, Jill wrote a series of articles on her family, the Baileys, for the Sioux Evening News. The articles received so many comments that she was encouraged to write her first book in 2003, Drummond Island, History, Folklore, and Early People. The following year, Jill spoke about her book here at the library at the Historical Society's annual meeting. Since then, she's written 3 more books on Drummond Island, along with regular articles on island history for area newspapers. She also has an article about growing up there in the latest issue of Michigan History magazine. Tonight she'll speak about her 4th book, Drummond Island's Part in the War of 1812, and her books are available for purchase afterwards. Please welcome Jill Brumwell.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. It doesn't seem possible it was 2004 that I was here last time. How time goes by, huh? The War of 1812 is a lesser known conflict in our American history. Gotta get used to using this laptop here. Let's see here. Maybe it'd help if I got my reading glasses on. Okay. Drummond Island was part of that conflict. Before it was named Drummond Island, it was named Pontiac by the Native Americans. It's roughly translated as island of a beautiful view of beautiful islands. The Indians gave thanks to Gitche Manitou, which was their great spirit. They thanked Gitche Manitou for leading them to Potaganape, and when they arrived at Potaganape, they were actually fleeing from the fierce Iroquois. And if anyone knows the history of Iroquois Point, they know how fierce the Iroquois were. Drummond Island had friendly Native Americans that were peaceable natives, and they were of the woodland period when they first arrived. Though Native Americans made Potaganape their home, they did go from place to place in search of food, because in their early development they weren't aware and they didn't know how to preserve food, and so they would go where food was plentiful. Consequently, they would pick up and move and reestablish themselves in different places. The French were the first to come to the North Country. They were claiming the land for the French, and the Indians lost their way of life and became dependent on clothing, implements, and guns. They trapped and hunted every fur-bearing animal without regard to depleting the supply. The British had become an unwanted presence. In 1715, French soldiers constructed the fort at present-day Mackinac City to combat the British. Something that I didn't realize until a little ways into my research, that Michilimackinac was called wherever the fort was located. In very early years, it started off, it had a different name, it was a French name, but even eventually the fort at St. Ignace was named Michilimackinac. Then it moved to Mackinac City, it was again called Michilimackinac. Then it moved to Mackinac Island, called Michilimackinac again. So whenever they mentioned Michilimackinac in history, you had to kind of know when these changes of location took place, so that you knew whether they were talking about Mackinac City or Mackinac Island. Excuse me, in 1715, French soldiers constructed the fort at present-day Mackinac City to combat the British. By 1754, hostilities had grown and erupted into the French and Indian War. The most famous victory of that war for the British was the capture of Quebec. The voyagers continued to travel from Montreal to Michilimackinac and Michilimackinac back to Montreal, despite the war that was going on. I remember reading where they would change their routes because they would know which routes were bad to take because of this conflict that was going on. Pontiac led a rebellion, which probably most of you are aware of. I thought it was quite a thing to, the fact that they were going to take 11 forts, and they did take 9 forts, 9 out of 11. I thought that was quite a victory for them. The most famous of all those 9 forts that they took was the one that took place at Mackinac City, and that was the massacre where Schoolcraft was there, and there was Ezekiel Solomon, that's big in history, and those are quite the tales to read about. The Revolutionary War followed that French and Indian War, and the French and Indian War was actually the French and British War. Of course, each side had Native Americans that aligned themselves. The Iroquois aligned themselves with the British, and the Algonquins, which had a lot of tribes under them, like the Ottawas and the Chippewas and many others, they aligned themselves with the French. They had a good relationship with the French because the French married into their culture, and they had bonds that were actually family bonds as well. During this time, the British moved the fort at Mackinac City to Mackinac Island because they thought that it was a better fortification to combat the British. At the end of the Revolutionary War, the fort at Mackinac Island was awarded to the United States. The British took 12 years to vacate. With the signing of the Jay Treaty, they were forced to leave and went to St. Joseph Island. War clouds were gathering. Great Britain needed sailors for her war with the French. The British were taking American vessels for trading and claiming sailors were British deserters. This was during President Jefferson's reign. Can everybody hear me back there? Mm-hmm. Okay. In 1809, James Madison became president. In the spring of 1812, war was inevitable. The grounds for declaring the war on Great Britain were the British had been encouraging the Indians to attack American citizens on the frontier. 2. They had been ruining American trade by their blockades. 3. They had insulted the American flag by stopping and searching our ships. 4. They had illegally seized American sailors and forced them to serve on British war vessels, and they violated United States neutral rights and territorial waters. Dispatching the news that war was declared was by horseback, foot, and water. The declaration made in Washington on June 18th reached Quebec June 25th. The British on St. Joseph Island, Canada, received word to attack Michilimackinac, presently at Mackinac Island, on July 25th. They were successful. The Americans on Mackinac Island weren't aware at all that war had been declared. John Johnson and Lord Ermitanger of the Sioux aided the British. The fort on Mackinac Island was given up without a fight. In fact, they say that Porter Hanks, the commandant at the fort at the time, that he woke up that morning. Everything was quiet because the villagers had all been taken from their homes and taken to I think it was a distillery, they said that it was called. What happened is when the flotilla came from St. Joseph Island, and it was a large flotilla of ships, some voyagers were leaving Mackinac Island to go to St. Joe Island to see if this was true, because they had heard rumors of the soldiers at St. Joseph Island organizing a party to come and take over the fort. And when they were leaving, the flotilla captured these voyagers. One of them had a farm on Mackinac Island, and they made him promise that he wouldn't divulge that they were on their way to attack the fort, but they would let him go back to Mackinac Island and tell the townspeople to leave because they were afraid that with the massacre that might take place, that a lot of unnecessary lives would be lost. And they also utilized the property of this man that had the farm on the one side of the island. Today when you visit Mackinac Island, they will tell you that this is British landing, which is just exactly where this place was. So anyway, when Porter Hanks woke up, he thought it was quite quiet. The reason it was quiet was because all the villagers had been taken away. And the next thing you knew, a big announcement came that the British were up in the hill above the fort. And because I think that there were only 70 officers at the fort at the time. And of course there were just a couple of thousand. I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's in my book. A lot of people that were up there ready to do battle. So there wasn't a shot fired. It was just a mutual on the part of everybody at the fort to just give in. So no shots were fired. The year 1813 had hardly begun when the president was informed by the Treasury that money was running out. Lieutenant Colonel Sir Gordon Drummond, and I always wondered what he looked like. There's his picture. He was made commander of all the forces in Canada. This was to mean much to the history of Pontiac. In the spring of 1814, the newly appointed Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDougal arrived from England to relieve the post at Mackinac Island. He too was to figure prominently in the history of Pontiac. Now Dolly Madison was the president's wife. Of course, they said in the history books that she was the first one that was called the First Lady. She was the first one to have that term as the wife of the president. And everybody loved her. And President Madison was said to be kind of a little bit, he was in ill health most of the time. And what he was like in his demeanor, she made up. Because everyone loved to be around her. She was vivacious. She seemed to settle a lot of political problems just with her presence, and she had a lot of parties. And they also said that she was the first one in the United States to introduce ice cream. That was kind of important. It makes you feel a little more, especially if you like ice cream and you like Dolly Madison. Let's see. She was the First Lady during that War of 1812. She was at the White House, and her husband had left, and she agreed with that because she thought that would bolster the troops, and so he was off in that respect, and she was back at the White House, and people were urging her to leave because she could even hear the fire of the gunfire, and she said she wanted to stay as long as she could. She'd go up on top of the roof of the White House and she'd look through what they called a spyglass, and seeing the fire from a distance was a bit scary, but she still stayed on until finally she was urged to leave. And she gathered up all the important documents, including George Washington's portrait. And we wouldn't have that in the White House today for all of us to see if it hadn't been for Dolly Madison. Because as soon as they got there, the British burned the White House. They said that they broke the windows and threw lighted torches through the window, and everything was burned. And of course, we wouldn't have Washington's picture if that hadn't been saved. In September of 1814, a naval battle took place near Pontiac. So this made the soldiers on Mackinac Island, the British, delighted because they thought they were really winning the war. It hadn't been but a month before, perhaps, I think it was in August, that the White House was destroyed. And now this naval battle took place right near Pontiac. And what that was happening there, 2 American vessels were patrolling that channel, and they were keeping the British on Mackinac Island from getting their food supply. So they were thinking winter is not too long coming, and we better take care of that. So they did. They managed to commandeer both vessels. The first one they got, and the second one was some 2 miles away, and they left all the flags flying like it was an American vessel, and they approached the other American vessel. Of course, all the people aboard were the British, and they took over the other vessel as well. It's interesting to read the history, and they refer to it happening around Burnt Island, and Burnt Island is a very familiar island to anyone that has anything to do with Drummond Island. Also in September, the British sailed into Fort McHenry, and that would be in Baltimore. It was here that Francis Scott Key witnessed the battle from a ship in the harbor and penned the words we all know, "O say, can you see by the dawn's early light." Before this battle, men representing the United States gathered in Ghent, Belgium, to discuss peace with British representatives. The peace treaty was signed on Christmas Eve, which was referred to as the Peace of Christmas Eve. Unfortunately, word would not be received in this country until February 14th, when the peace treaty had been signed, as we said, Christmas Eve. Needless to say, there was another battle that took place. The Battle of New Orleans took place, and lots of lives were needlessly lost because they didn't know the war was really over. And that was the last battle of the war. And as we said, that was the Battle of New Orleans. With the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, the history of the British fort on Drummond Island begins. Word arrived at Mackinac Island, the British had to give up their fort. And again, when I told you before, they took 12 years to get out when the Revolutionary War was over. They didn't take quite as long, but they still didn't get out the date they were supposed to. And the Americans arrived, and they were very easygoing about it, and they camped. I could just imagine them camping on that lower part there, where there's the boat harbor now, and to see the fort up above, and knowing a little bit about history makes these places seem more real when you think about them and what happened there. And so they did finally leave, and they left on June 18th, 1815, and they set sail for Pontiac. There had been historic facts that shows that McDougal, who was the commandant of that fort at the time, that he had had some correspondence with somebody on Drummond Island, and Drummond Island had a trading post there, so they were aware of Drummond, and they probably through the correspondence thought that would be a good place to relocate because of its location. Of course, it's sitting there where you've got Lake Superior to the north, and Lake Michigan, and Drummond Island is right at the mouth of the St. Mary's River, but theoretically part of it is in Lake Huron, of course. So it was a good location. Let's see, this is one of the buildings that were constructed with gigantic fireplaces such as this on Drummond Island after the British got there, which they did on June 18th, 1815. And if you could see on that map, I guess you can, there's a little green arrow at this one end where you see Ferry Dock, and that's where the British relocated on Drummond Island, and today that's called Whitney Bay, but in that era it was called Collier's Cove. There was a Captain Collier, and there's no doubt that that's where the name Collier's Cove came from, and the fact that the fort was actually called Fort Collier. And later that the name was changed to Whitney Bay, and I understand that that was a financier that bought up a lot of properties and stuff, so we don't know that bay today as Collier's Cove. The limestone bedrock there made an ideal parade ground, and anybody that's been there can see what we're talking about. Larry jokes because we've gone to parties there at one of the homes, and he says that it's like Walmart parking lot. It's really a limestone bedrock, but that was where the parade ground was. And also, Drummond has high banks there, which were made even a little steeper by the British, and that was just about their only form of fortification on that side, which is the Detour Passage, because the country, England, would not give them much money to further any improvements. Most of what they gave them was to go to give the Native Americans their gifts. It must have been a busy time because those Britishers had to frantically get buildings erected for the winter, which everyone knew was going to be coming in just a few months. Now here's a picture of one of the fireplaces. Let's see. Well, there's Fort Collier's Cove. Let's see what we've done here. That's the map again. Okay.
Go back one, that's where the fireplace was.
This is what Fort Collier Cove was like, according to an artist of the times. And this is one of the fireplaces referred to as a chimney from Samuel F. Cook's book, printed in 1896. This appears to me to be up on that side of the island that is on the Detour Passage, the mainland of Detour being right across from that part of Drummond. And the British built these wonderful roads, which Samuel F. Cook mentions in his book. And they were so well constructed that in the 1950s, one of the actual roads was redone, so it became the Artillery Road again. And that was designed, of course, for them to leave their post on the one side. See, the fort was located on a point that stuck out from Drummond Island, and it wasn't too far across that point, maybe 1.5 to 2 miles. And so on the one side was this beautiful Collier's Cove, very protected by islands. On the other side was the Detour Passage. So all of their homes and things, for the most part, were on that inner cove, but some were scattered up on the higher elevation. But they had an artillery road that would take their artillery pieces up to the top if they should need them there. And that is the road that Mrs. Gunther had reconstructed when she sold some property on the island. So if you drive down that way, you're going to see the artillery road on the street side. Now, the first, I guess maybe we should read what I had put down here from Samuel F. Cook's book, which was printed in 1896. The structures used by the garrison were unusually large for log houses and were also more scattered than was usual for a military post. The parade ground fronted on the bay, and barracks and commissary buildings were at the western border, while back of these a rock hill rose suddenly. The officers' quarters were scattered here and there in such a manner as, judging from their appearance, they chanced to be dropped down without assignment of location by the engineer or reference to the other buildings. The boulevard, which passed on the east front of the town site lots and thence to the parade ground, beyond which it again appears as the artillery road to the shore of the Detour Strait. It had deep gutter lines at the edges of a well-rounded roadway to carry the water quickly away from summer torrents and departing winter snows. This roadway, for the distance of about 2,000 feet, its northerly end beginning some 500 feet from the bay, is 3 times the width of the artillery road. The bold curve of land into the bay at the east side of the boulevard was reserved without any buildings for gardens. Near its center is an unusually large cellar that furnished ample storage for all the potatoes and other vegetables needed. There are broad and well-graded avenues, great chimneys of stone with their ample fireplaces marking where stood upwards of 50 buildings, kitchen garden plots, wildflowers and underbrush intermingled with rose bushes which still bear blossoms, while apple, cherry, plum, and pear trees still bear fruit, and at no great distance lies the city of the sleeping dead. Now this, of course, is a picture taken in 1896 of the cemetery on Drummond Island. And in fact, I think this one, I think that says Solomon on it. I think you'll find that one in the museum today on Drummond Island. And he talks about larger, well-built homes and bark lodges, lime kilns and wharfs. He mentions seeing Lombardy poplars planted in a row. For fire safety, baking was done in a public bakehouse, though not mentioned by Mr. Cook. I found references to a store and a tavern at the fort. And I knew Mrs. Anna Ellis, who when a child remembered Samuel Cook camping on the fort property, which is right across from her family's enterprise on Whitney Bay, right across the bay. And By this time, of course, it was called Whitney Bay when Mrs. Ellis lived there. Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel McDougal, he attempted to buy Drummond Island, and he made an arrangements with the chief who lived in the Saginaw area, and their tribe had free reign of the village whenever they wanted to go there, so they would go there and they'd drink the rum and they'd eat the food and so on and so forth, with the agreement that if the island did get to be deemed an American island, that the British would then buy it from the chief from Saginaw, Michigan. In 1819, Walk on the Water was the first steamship that was seen on the Great Lakes. But that was 1819, and going back to that first winter they were there, which would have been the winter of 1815, 1816, many men were dying from scurvy. It was due to a bad diet, primarily of salted meats was about all they had to eat, and they appealed to their country, they pleaded, I guess I should say, for them to get better food for these soldiers because they were dying like 15 and 16 in 1 month. And of course the graveyard, as I showed you, was pretty crowded with all the headstones. You knew that they had a lot of deaths. And they didn't seem to get anything from Amherstburg, which was their headquarters in Canada. And so they appealed to the Americans on Mackinac Island, of all things. And I thought they were pretty nice. They sent one of their surgeons. They seemed to call all the doctors surgeons, whether they were regular just practitioners or whether they were really surgeons, I don't know. But anyway, they sent their doctor from Mackinac Island, and they sent some limes and some other things, and the situation improved a lot just because of their treatment. And yet it was kind of strange because McDougal still kept talking very disparagingly about the Americans on Mackinac Island, and it sounds like he was kind of an ornery fellow. And it wasn't too long that he was relieved of his post on Drummond, to tell you the truth. Now, several worlds blended on Drummond Island. There was a Dr. David Mitchell. His wife had a, we can check on the time here. His wife was on Mackinac Island because they had a big fur trading business, and she was a Native American, understood English, couldn't speak anything but Native Americans, or didn't anyway, and she was really abused on Mackinac Island by the Americans who didn't like her involvement in the fur industry. And it was said that one night she left in a canoe all by herself and left the island because she was wary and afraid of what was going on there, I guess, and arrived at Drummond Island and ended staying there for the rest of her life. And she's one of the ones that they know are buried in the cemetery there in Drummond. They know about how many are buried there, and there's a very few that they really know the names of. And they said that Mrs. Mitchell was a whist player, that she instigated getting groups together to play whist. Seems kind of interesting when you think that she didn't speak the language, and but I guess she maybe just played cards. I mean, she may have been one of the best players when you think about it, and the rest were all chattering maybe. But there was another interesting person there written in the history of the island. Josette De Chartres. She was said to be a beautiful, elegant woman, slender and very accomplished, because she was a wonderful violinist. And she was asked to go to Mackinac Island. On and on, it seems strange when you think of the way they went back and forth. Most of the stories are of the British on Drummond Island going to Mackinac Island and the other way around. Of course, the Native Americans traveled from one port to the other, and they did tell stories back and forth. And I guess the more that they had the tales to tell, the more that they were given the rum to drink. So that's why they did it. And they caused a lot of trouble because I don't think all the things that they carried back and forth were necessarily true. But apparently Josette's husband got tired of her playing all over the place, and supposedly he stepped on her violin one night in a fit of rage, and that was the end of her violin playing. Another one was William Solomon. He was the son of Ezekiel Solomon, who was very well known in that part of history and was actually at the fort during the massacre there. at the fort at Mackinac City. There was a William Simpson, who was well known, and then a Lieutenant Colonel Robert Dixon, who was a very tall, over 6 feet tall Scot with red hair, and he was really thought of one of the most admirable men of his times, and he was very good with the Native Americans. He was on the British side. And then there was a Thomas Anderson, who came with the Indian Department, and there were 75 Voyager families, and the winters were spent visiting each other's households, and folks loved to go to the Voyagers' homes. Most of them were married to Native Americans, and the way they combined their culture, they were wonderful storytellers, and it was a pleasure and entertainment to be there in some of those households. There was hidden treasure that took place. Apparently there was a man who was an assistant deputy, his last name was Monk, and he was on the island, and he was in charge of the treasury, and they paid the soldiers in gold, and he was supposed to have been a little bit deranged after a while, I guess the pressure of his job and whatever, but he was supposed to have had an assistant who saw him disappear with a some kind of a kettle, and supposedly there was a good deal of gold in it, and he left, and when he came back he didn't have the kettle, and so they say that this buried gold on Drummond, there were tales of people that were looking for it for years. I don't remember anybody looking for it in our generation, do you, Barbara? Barbara and I grew up on Drummond Island. She's sitting over here in that second row. But anyway, it makes a good story, and I suppose in those early years people did look for this gold, and it was a current story. By this time, MacDougall wasn't in good terms with the British headquarters, and when over 5,000 Indians arrived on Drummond Island in June of 1816, MacDougall received orders not to speak to the Indians at this council, and shortly after he negotiated the sale of his house and asked to be relieved of his command. He returned to England and was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Mall. When Lieutenant Colonel Mall took over, he asked again to his country to give them more money to fortify the fort, and they refused. And so this property up on top of the hill overlooking the Detour Passage that Lieutenant Colonel MacDougall had cleared to build a large blockhouse for fortification purposes. It was all used to plant potatoes. And so that was the end of, I guess, the actual fortification of the fort. It looked more like a community than it did a fort. In 1816, the Boundary Commission was appointed with representatives from each country. Let's see here. Tales were carried back and forth between the American post on Mackinac Island and the British post on Drummond Island. A Protestant Englishman arrived from Montreal to assume the duties of a schoolmaster. So with that little bit of information, I think that I found that in about the 21st book I read about that era. But then I came to the conclusion, well, they did have a school there of some sort. England's declining interest in the fort on Drummond Island can be seen in the officers in charge. First, an important lieutenant colonel, and by 1818, a major, Thomas Howard, who wasn't there long, and it was said that he was court-martialed and replaced by Major James Winnett. And as much as I looked, I couldn't find anything about Major Thomas Howard or find out why he was court-martialed. In winter activities, of course, winters were quite boring, and they were so cold that it was said that the log houses cracked with the cold. The commandant, this one particular year, decided to kind of boost the morale of the men. He would have a troop come from Detroit. So he hired a troop to come from the Detroit area. No time at all, the manager's daughter, who was a very pretty young thing, a couple of the soldiers just started having interest in her, causing a lot of fights among the soldiers. So it wasn't too long, the tour wasn't over, and the commandant sent them back to Detroit, from whence they had come. They also did what they called snowshoe walking. It's kind of a strange term. I guess we all know what snowshoes are. And snowshoe walking is something that they did. They also had some horses and cutters, and they said that it was often a sight to see somebody going the artillery road up to the precipice looking over the Detour Straits, and it was a beautiful view, and it was nice in the winter as well. In 1820, Dr. Bixby traveled to Drummond Island. By the way, this is what the British fort on Drummond eventually looked, according to, I think it was Bixby that drew this picture. And that two-story house, that would be the Commandant's house. And when Colonel McDougal had that assembled there, he brought it over from St. Joe Island at his own expense, and that undoubtedly is his. In fact, I think it says on here, the Commandant's quarters.
I know.
In 1820, that was the year that Dr. Bixby visited the island, and he was a wonderful writer, and that's where a lot of the great information comes from a human interest point of view. And Miss Hamilton and Miss Upshur arrived at the fort. Miss Hamilton was the granddaughter of Dr. Mitchell, and she and Miss Upshur were living with them. And this Thomas Anderson that I mentioned first, that came with the Indian Department, he fell in love with Miss Hamilton, and he asked her hand in marriage, and they were married on Mackinac Island. In fact, Miss Upshur married one of the Mitchell's sons. So you can imagine what went on in that little small community. It was in February, and the ladies of the community pruned their house plants, so they had some nice flowers at this wedding. And the men of the garrison went around and picked up chairs, and they had this wedding in February of 1820. Also in 1820, Governor Lewis Cass, and that's his picture, looks like Napoleon with this. He made a historic visit to Sault Ste. Marie. The building of Fort Brady was to follow. Schoolcraft's narrative of the expedition to the sources of the Mississippi mentions the importance of the fort and its importance because of Drummond Island and their need to be close to where the British were. Major Delafield wrote, he was one of the men of the Boundary Commission. It took several years to determine the boundary. Of course, they did all their traveling in the summer, and they did all their writing of the charts and everything, and their plans for the next year in the winter. And Major Delafield wrote of the Boundary Commission stopping at an island off of Drummond Island's north side. And I kind of wonder if that isn't the island that was called Chickanabish by the people on Drummond in the early years. Then it was changed to Bollinger Island. But anyway, we know that there were Native Americans living there, and we know that that's where Helen McGinnis's ancestors came from. Her name was Helen LaPointe before she married a McGinnis. And anyway, Cadott that had the fort, he was an interpreter and a very important person here in Sioux, Michigan. And when the fort burned here in Sioux, Michigan, people referred to it as Cadott's fort burning. So that's how important he was. And about 200 years after that incident, a Cadott family, a descendant of the Cadott that was here in the Sioux, raised a family on Chickanabish. And that is the island that I think that they stopped at. This Major Delafield refers to the Native Americans running when he arrived, where their ship arrived, and then they were talked back to come and not be afraid by some Frenchmen that lived there. Well, that fits in with this Cadott. And this Major Delafield talks about buying a canoe for $7, nicely made by these Native Americans on this island. There were deserters from the post too, and of course you got to stop and think of how lonely the post probably was, and it is true, although it's not officially documented. But legends tell us that 2 deserters left one day, and the commandant at the time was so angry about it that he went out and he posted a note outside on some building or wherever notes are posted that he would give so much money. I think it was I think they figured in American terms it was $25, but whatever it was at the time, he offered this reward. If they found the 2 deserters dead, to bring back their heads. Mm-hmm. And if they found them alive, they were to bring them back alive, and he had this reward for both of them. Well, anyway, the next thing that happened is that the Native Americans that were the ones that left that day after they read the notice on the board came back with the head swinging from their belts, and they got their money, and that was supposed to be the end of that, because they did get word from Amherstburg not to post any rewards for deserters again. But there's supposed to be legends that people see bonfires with the two British soldiers sitting there. And that is kind of the story, was that the Native Americans crept up behind them, and they were taken by surprise and unaware that they were about to die over this incident of desertion. This is in reference to the Boundary Commission, and I don't know if you can see it very well up there, but let's see here. Now this is Drummond Island right here. This is Coburn. Manitoulin would be over here, very, very large island. And they're all in a row. And the Boundary Commission was supposed to make the boundary as straight as possible and not bisect any island. But look what they did. They went along this way. They went up between Coburn and Drummond, over the top of Drummond, came back down again and picked up St. Joe. And this is what I would say would have made it a straighter boundary. And there are other stories that say that Drummond was a bargaining chip and they waited until towards the end of it. But there are a lot of stories. But it does seem strange that to this very day they call that passage between Coburn and Drummond the false detour, which indicates that they falsely detoured through there. So supposedly the reason they got away with that, if this story is indeed true, is that the British representative of Mr. Barclay, that he got a little compliant when he had some rum, and they supposedly planned when they would do this when he was in those kind of situations. So as I said, there's about 3 stories about how this happened, but it is strange that the boundary is not straight when it's supposed to be. Now, Alex St. Martin, I guess we probably don't have too much time to talk about. What did I do here now? Let's see, I'm supposed to do escape. There we go. Whew. I got some lessons on this just before the director left. Alex St. Martin, have any of you heard that story about him on Mackinac Island and being one of the voyagers and getting the hole blasted in his stomach? And as a result of that, even today, the classes on the action of the stomach is still very much the notes that was taken by Dr. Beaumont in that era. And I feel that because of the proximity of Drummond and Mackinac Island, that Dr. Mitchell on Mackinac Island was probably very aware of this and very interested in it. This happens to be a picture of the rapids in the Sioux with the Native Americans. In 1824, some voyagers brought smallpox to the Native Americans on Drummond Island, and many of them died. And this is a picture, I think it was taken in about 1952. And of course, somebody had to be rekindling these spirit houses. They wouldn't have lasted that long, but the word is that many of the people that died at that time, the Native Americans, were buried on Rutland Island, and that's just out from the north side of Drummond. This is Dr. Beaumont, the one that did those experiments with the fellow Alex St. Martin. And as you probably know, there are many institutions of hospital, those kind of the nature hospital care facilities that's named after Dr. Beaumont. This is Fort Collier, kind of how it looked in 1828 by Dr. Bixby. At that time, in 1828, when the British were told to vacate Drummond Island by President Monroe, he had some of the soldiers from Fort Brady in the Sioux go to Drummond Island and make a list of all of the buildings, which this is a list of them, and make an assessment of the worth of them and pay the British off in pounds and tell them that it was time they left. They knew in 1822, it's documented, that it was an American island, and yet they still stayed on for another 6 years. Nobody seemed to be pushing them out, so they just stayed. And they wouldn't have left in November, as you know, because the weather's so bad, but they were forced to leave at that time. So they were paid in pounds, and they were told to leave. And they left on this on more than one ship. This happens to be the Duke of Wellington. And legends tell us, in fact, I got this information from Canada in a Canada library. Anyway, when they left Drummond that time in 1828 in November, they slaughtered their winter feed they had brought over from St. Joe Island because Drummond had no pasture land. And so they would bring over the food for winter, and they had sheep and cattle, and they were supposed to slaughter these animals and hung them on the side of the Duke of Wellington, thinking that as they went to undisputed British territory, which would have been Penetanguishene, that these would be saved because of the cold water splashing against them. But legends tell us that it took 5 days to get there, and I'm surprised too, in 5 days they didn't keep with that cold water splashing on them. But anyway, they weren't able to use this, the meat. Talking about the Duke of Wellington, at that time, most of the history books tell you that they all left for Penetanguishene, but I found that wasn't true. That 10 people went to Amherstburg. So a ship called the Cincinnati left at the same time and went to Amherstburg. The Duke of Wellington went to Penetanguishene. Also, Mr. Solomon, he contacted a Captain Hackett, and his ship was called the Alice Hackett, and he owned the ship. And I found interesting information about him because I knew his ship was shipwrecked. Turned out he had shipwrecked several ships, and he owned them all, so I guess he couldn't get fired from his job. And when they left that day, they had a store of rum from the tavern, and as they were going along in bad weather, which didn't help anything, the soldiers got into the rum, and so did Captain Hackett. There was a Mrs. Lapine and her husband on board. Now, Mr. Lapine was drinking along with the rest of them. They were traveling along in this bad weather and these bad circumstances, and they were shipwrecked off an island called Fitzwilliam Island. And the natives around Fitzwilliam Island call it today Horse Island, because the story goes is when the ship was wrecked, a lot of the livestock, well, maybe all the livestock got off, and they tried to catch the livestock after everybody recovered, and they could not catch the horse. So a horse lived on the island for many years, was seen by people, and therefore they call the island Horse Island. Well, Mrs. Lapine was left on board while these soldiers and her husband in their intoxicated state got off the ship, forgetting completely about Mrs. Lapine. I don't know why she didn't say something about it. Maybe she was sleeping down below her. I have no idea. I can't understand that part of the story. But supposedly she lashed herself to the mast, held the baby in her arms, and all night long she stayed on this boat as it crashed against these rocks. And later I read where they ended up saving her in the morning when they recovered, and they went aboard and got Mrs. Lapine off the boat in a yawl boat. And they eventually got to Penetanguishene, and the infant survived. Her name was, I guess it would have been pronounced Teresa, but it was spelled different, like Therese or something like that. And also I read where Captain Hackett eventually became a lighthouse keeper at Penetanguishene, and that was supposed to be because of his wife's persuasion. And I was thinking she probably was tired of him wrecking boats, so she was making sure he got this job. And the story was kind of a funny one. Supposedly they were in Penetanguishene, and she knew that the lighthouse keeper was going to be coming up. So she's walking down this gravelly road, and along comes this commissioner or whatever he was, and she said to him, "You know, I'd like to speak up for my husband. It'd be nice if he got that position at the lighthouse." Now this tale says that he was supposed to have said, "Well, I've always liked your dog Sailor, so if you'd see that I could have your dog Sailor, I'll put in a good word for Captain Hackett." Well, I guess it all took place because he eventually became the lighthouse keeper, and to show their appreciation, the next child that Captain Hackett and his wife had, they named it after this commissioner. So that was kind of the end of that story. So now we're in the present time of what we would see on Drummond today, although this picture was probably taken in the very early 1900s. When the British left Drummond Island, it was a sad day for them, and they mentioned about how the flag was taken down by a Sergeant Ralston and how he cried, and the Stars and Stripes were raised immediately after that. And I think that we also had one back here that showed some travelers. Yes, here we go. This I thought reminded me of the stories that I read. I got books from Michigan State University. They even sent me books they weren't even supposed to send me, which was wonderful of them. But it was all about her travels. And she traveled in about, let's see, they left in 1820. I think she traveled like in 1837 or something like that. And it was like going to Mars or something in a few years. Travelers from Europe coming over here was like really going to a real strange new country. And so she traveled a lot. I also thought it was kind of funny because although all the things I read about the Drummond Fort, I've never heard them mention mosquitoes, yet Mrs. Jameson mentioned mosquitoes. You could not believe what they went through with mosquitoes when she was traveling. So I'm looking at my notes here and I remember the date right, 1837. She traveled to the Great Lakes area. And the fort property all went into private hands. This is a picture taken of the first property that went into private hands. We know that Reverend Luther was there about 1913. And I don't know if you can see very well. I guess you can here. You see this little small chimney here? Mm-hmm. And there's probably 3 or 4 in a row there. Mm-hmm. And then in the distance, a big one. Now, people wonder about those 3 different opinions, and I suppose Samuel Cook had speculated as to what they were. Some people thought they were an infirmary, and that these chimneys were in individual rooms where they had, you know, the sick people. Other people thought they were from the baking house. They did go and bake because they were so afraid of fires that they didn't do any baking. And even the chimneys didn't have any evidence of cranes or anything where they did any cooking in these gigantic chimneys. And it was said that in one winter they burned enough wood to have built the places in the first place. So you know they used the fireplaces for heat. But that, and also if you look at that picture, that chimney at the end, that very large one, that one is on Ann Stadler's property. Anybody that goes there, they want to go to Drummond and see a lot of this stuff. Ann Stadler has a bed and breakfast there. And that particular chimney that we're seeing right there eventually became the chimney in her house, or fireplace, I should say. Let's see here. This is a picture of my uncle, Rue Haken. His daughter was Gail, who Barbara knew real well. And this is Reverend Luther. And they're talking about that grave board. That one is at the museum today. What did I do here? No, there I go to get escape again. Okay. This is my Uncle Rue again. He was a conservation officer on Drummond. That's what the uniform is. But this is when there were some palisades left of the cemetery. Now, that chimney right there is the one you saw in that picture I had up. And this actually, the one that's on the right is actually the one that is Ann Stadler's cottage today. And it works better than our much newer fireplace on Drummond Island. This one was built in 1815 by the British. They probably didn't even know how to build fireplaces. Ours was built in 1990. And it doesn't draw as well as Ann's does. Okay, here's Ann's house being constructed there. You see that, and this is over 100 years old, this picture, because Ann's house is probably about 102 or 3 now. And if you're there today, you're going to see this big fireplace that's standing there for anyone to have a picture taken with. It makes a wonderful photograph. This is a chimney that it is on private property, but it's actually on old fort property. And if you could look through those trees behind that chimney that you see, you're going to see a huge, huge hole, cavern, whatever you call a big, gigantic hole, where they have been quarrying. And over on the side of, behind and to the left of that wonderful fireplace there. There was another fireplace that had a big board propped against it because it was about to fall in the hole. It was funny, it actually was falling towards the land, and I guess the hole was undermining its structure because it was falling forward. And it was just a wonderful looking fireplace, despite the fact that it was all cattywampus. And that was given to the museum, which you'll see today if you go to the museum on Drummond. They've got a fireplace constructed at the end of it, which was from those rocks of that fireplace that was ready to fall over. This is a well that's there today. There's the fence around it. And that was a well that the British, of course, had when they were there. This is, I had wonderful cooperation from the Mackinac City, Mackinac Island Fort. If you look at my book, the historian even signed on the back, gave a little blurb for me, which was wonderful that he did that. He must have liked the book. This is a hat plate that was found in Mackinac Island, Mackinac City, and these are some buttons, and they can determine by these digs what regiments were there at the time. That's what makes the archaeology so interesting. This is just to show you about Drummond today and the ferry schedule that runs year-round and so on and so forth. And there's also a plaque that tells you about the War of 1812 and Drummond's part. And though most of the fort is on private property, actually the fort extended to where the ferry dock is today. And although it's private property, so I didn't put it in my book, if you're clever, you could find an old lime kiln that is on the north side of the ferry, where the cars approach the ferry. And if you find that site and you walk through the woods so that you're coming to the road, and then across the road, you're going to see a lot of debris and ruins that a discerning eye can tell that those were lime kilns also. And when they reconstructed that road, you see the ferry used to go across at a different site, then it was changed to try to arrive at a different point. And that was done because it was a better location for winter. The other location, it seemed to have ice that would get stuck in there, and it was just more difficult, where this was a better location. But when they did that, then they disrupted what lime kilns were there. But you can see that they aren't natural, big hunks of rock and construction like. And the historic marker is there at the ferry dock, telling about the Treaty of Ghent and so on and so forth. And if you go to the museum, they do their best to maintain the fort history. It's difficult because there is no place where one can go to really view things like Mackinac Island has. But there's a diorama with the fort as little buildings are made out of wood that they have there for you to see. And let's see, this is about the other books that I wrote. And for my book, I had in my other books used a poem that my mother wrote, and as my mother hadn't written any that really applied to the fort, I had to write my own poem. And I'll tell you that I was asked to join a poet society because they liked it so well. But I realized that all the poems they showed me that they wrote, none of them rhymed. They were all just words. So I really didn't think I'd fit in because my poem had to rhyme. But my poem is as follows. I found an arrow point today, lost by some brave beside the way. He stalked his game and roamed about these bays and islands that we love. A limestone chimney standing tall reminds me of a family gone. Nearby one can see their well. Did children live here? Who can tell? Their kitchen gardens grown to grass, fruit trees evidence where we pass, yielding fruit year after year, evidence that the British were here. What can we leave ere we pass on, that generations yet unborn may search and find and know that we were part of Drummond Island history?
Are you going to answer any questions? I have a quick one. Were the British first on St. Joe's Island and then moved to Drummond Island? Because in some of the history books you read that when John Johnston and the Native Americans left from here to help the British take Fort Mackinac, they picked up on St. Joseph Island
Sure.
and then went.
Oh, yeah.
So did the British have two forts, one on St. Joseph Island as well as one on Drummond Island? Is that, am
No.
I understanding that correctly?
No, see, they were on St. Joe Island
First.
first. And when they captured Mackinac Island, that was the next step of their moving around. When they had to give up that fort because of the Treaty of Ghent, the fort on Mackinac Island, they thought about building a fort at Sault Ste. Marie, but they thought they would not do that. And at Fort St. Joseph, you see, they had a fort there. But when the British took Mackinac Island, the Americans, in retaliation, burned all of the fort on St. Joe Island except a few of the buildings. But for the most part, the fort was destroyed.
Okay.
And so they would have had to rebuild that. So it came to a point, well, now which location would be better? Because they had to build it on St. Joe Island because it was destroyed. And they decided that Drummond Island had a better location for their fur trading. So,
Thank you.
The naming of Coburn Island, just a few miles off the shore of Drummond Island, of course, for, I assume, Vice Admiral Coburn, the officer in charge of the British forces that sacked Washington in 1814, appears to be a vitally cheeky gesture on the part of the British. Do you have any comment on that?
what was that last sentence you said?
It's a very cheeky thing to do, I would think.
You know, I know nothing about Coburn's name, and so I can't comment on that at all. Sorry, I know it's so close to Drummond that when you're at that side of Drummond, it's just a matter of a short distance apart. And we were sailboaters for many years, and I remember traveling back from Manitoulin Island and crossing. We were still staying on the north side of Drummond, but we were crossing that Coburn space there, the space between Coburn and Drummond, I mean. And we actually saw a large bear swimming. And we didn't know what it was at first, and so we went over closer to it, and it didn't like that at all. But it was quite a thrill to see it. So I know the bear swim.
Did they consider the War of 1812 a draw, or did one side actually win the war, or British won?
That's why you don't know about it. I know there was a comment in something that I read recently, because there's been a lot of articles about the War of 1812, being this is the bicentennial year, and there was reference to that kind of confusion as to just who won the war. But if you get a chance, and I did talk quite a bit in my book, but I could not put a lot of it in there, but the negotiations that took place in Belgium for the Treaty of Ghent, it was really something. They sent these representatives from the United States, and the British thought that it was such a trivial thing, that we were just upstart colonists without a lot of brains. So they even kind of went back and forth about who they were going to represent England, and they didn't send the best of people. Some of them were very old, and some of them were not considered at all really an outstanding diplomat. And so it's really interesting the way that our representatives were excellent attorneys. And but it was a grueling time for them. I think they were there about they were there, they went in the summer in June, and they didn't get done till Christmas Eve. So they were there all that time, sending things back and forth. And this Gatlin was one of the representatives from the state. And when he got back, and they didn't get back till February, but he died shortly afterwards. It was a very, very, very taxing and grueling assignment that they had. And as I read it, I really felt proud that they did this for us, because if they hadn't been as clever as they were, and if the British hadn't sent kind of a little lesser brigade, then it might have turned out differently. So.
So having grown up on Drummond with you, I I would hear about the fort. I knew it was on private property, so you never got to see anything except the one chimney that was on Dolomite Quarry property. I pictured a fort, a fighting fort with palisades, and reading your book, it just told me the story. It was, I loved your book because
Thank you.
it told me what really happened there, and it wasn't like there.
The England just turned its back on any extensive fortification. And the monies that were sent were all, and I could not believe how much that the history books claimed was spent. It was like $100,000 a year on goods for the Indians for the trade of furs, which would have been a terrible amount in those days. And yet they didn't want to spend any money on building.
I also found it interesting when you mentioned in your book about the thousands of Indians that would be there
Oh,
at
yes.
the time. There's only 1,000 people live there now.
Yeah, and when they would arrive, they'd arrive on that one end of the island where the fort was located, and in no time they set up their wigwams and they'd run around and they'd have everything all. They were good at relocating. That was for sure. And there was a lot of romantic things, like this one commissioner was there, and he heard this Indian playing a beautiful flute song, and he asked about it, and he was told by this Thompson, that was the Indian, what did they call him, from the Indian Department, I guess. Anyway, he said that he was playing this because he was trying to woo some Indian maiden, and but it was a kind of a melancholy, beautiful song, I guess, that he heard there. And they also had things like this Thomas Gunnarsson, that was the Indian representative there in the Indian Department. I remember reading one about they had a race he put together, and the reward were these silver bracelets, and the women were the ones who were racing the canoes. And it talked about, I think there were like 8 Native Americans in the canoe, and how in each canoe, I guess there was more than one, of course, it was a contest, and they were to go around some ship that was anchored in the bay, and there was all kinds of excitement. The whole community was out watching this race that took place, and the ones that got all their bracelets, got the bracelets as their reward. So that was kind of a fun thing. There was evidence that they had quite a community there, and it was quite diversified. There were a lot of different people, a lot of different levels of, like, some could read English and some couldn't, some could understand French but couldn't speak it. You kind of wondered how they all got along when there was, what kind of communication took place, because there was, and also a lot of different levels of education among the people too.
You mentioned a fur trading post. Was that, we know that, after Johnston's fur trading post was burned by the Americans, he did establish a fur trading post with his sons on Drummond Island. Was that his fur trading post that you mentioned?
I know there was a fur, in fact, after the fort, there was a fur trading post over on the Pontiac River. That would be over on the north side of Drummond. There was a fur trading post there, and that might have been where he was. I'm not sure. That it? Well, thank you so much for having me here tonight, and I hope